During World War I, submachine guns appeared on the battlefields, and in World War II, all the nations involved in the conflict would equip themselves with them, of those that in fact are the absolute kings of close quarters combat at that time. These automatic weapons, usually 9mm, are deadly compared to bolt-action rifles, for example, in close-range firefights. And Italy had what many consider to be the best submachine gun of World War II. This, of course, is a MAP-38, and today we'll discover its history, its mechanics, and we'll test it. If the Villa Arperosa was the first weapon capable of firing pistol ammunition automatically, it was more often used as a machine gun. Tactically light, especially speaking, the first real submachine guns were also Italian and German. The Maschinenpistole 18 became a bit of the archetype, the paradigm of what a submachine gun should conceptually be. However, the Italians too, as the end of the First World War approached, developed two of their own submachine guns, both actually derived from the Villa Arperosa. For those who don't know, the Villa Arperosa was, in fact, this light machine gun, actually made up of two parts. They were two so-called weapons attached side by side, and by separating them, then using just one weapon and working on a casing, you could get what we would nowadays consider a submachine gun. Engineer Ravelli, who built the Villa Arperosa, later developed the Officine Villa Arperosa 1918. Officine Villa Arperosa stands for Officine Villa Arperosa. A somewhat different project, maybe a bit more radical in the changes that would be introduced, is that of Tullio Marangoni. With Beretta, for what would become the Beretta 1918, Tullio Marangoni, the brilliant inventor from the Beretta family, would prepare a series of studies and approach things a bit more systematically. The challenge of designing the perfect pistol caliber weapon is clear. At this time, only the highly successful Maschinenpistole 18 submachine gun exists worldwide. There are no real shoulder-fired weapons, meaning long guns in pistol caliber. There isn't much to copy, and we don't even know exactly what we want for ourselves. Today it's obvious with hindsight that the submachine gun, let's take the classic submachine gun from World War II, is a 9mm weapon, usually with an open bolt, and so on and so forth. At that moment, this wasn't clear, so he approached this problem with a study. He will mainly study the firing modes and the trigger system. He will study a fully automatic version, a semi-automatic version, and a version that we could call selective fire. In particular, for this selective fire version, he will use a technical solution that will become somewhat famous throughout this entire series of submachine guns he built. And the Beretta, the two-trigger solution, where one trigger operates the semi-automatic fire and the other trigger operates the automatic fire. The Beretta automatic carbine of 1918 would serve in the Royal Army, but very quickly its obsolescence became apparent. The main issue was the ammunition, the 9 Glicenti, which matched the 9 Parabellum in size, but was much weaker in pressure and velocity. The second thing was that, despite a series of experiments, the magazine remained mounted on top of the weapon. It wasn't an ideal position for many different reasons, although, to be clear, there will be others. Other submachine guns were also successful. In World War II, for example, I think of the OEN with its top-mounted magazine. The design, with many small changes, would evolve into the MAB 1830. The MAB 1830 is quite a unique weapon because it starts to look like a modern submachine gun, we could say. But actually, more strictly speaking, it's a semi-automatic carbine. In fact, it's not automatic and fires from a closed bolt with a hammer, even though it's modern in its top ejection and bottom magazine. The MAB 1830, also known as Sirengoni, is nicknamed for its charging handle, which resembles a syringe or the Schmidt-Rubens. For this reason, it is not very widespread, and only a very few examples end up with the Army Regiment, particularly with the Tank Corps. The vast majority of the production actually goes to the so-called forestry militia, which will simply become the Forest Rangers. Today, many examples involve the Forestry Carabinieri and Argentine police. However, there was always the problem of the 9 Glicenti, a new submachine gun for the Royal Army. They wanted a more powerful round. They wanted to be more in line with what was being done abroad, where more powerful ammunition was being used. Thus, a new 9mm round would be created, which some might describe as a variant of the 9x19, while others consider it a fully legitimate cartridge in its own right, considering that in this caliber there was no other weapon. It's the well-known 9mm M38 or Super Fiocchi, which achieved nearly 450 meters per second from a submachine gun barrel. A very respectable power, what we would call today a 9mm plus P and overpressure round. Even though the MAP 1830 was actually created and only produced as a semi-automatic, there were a series of experiments to make it automatic. The MAP 38, what becomes the MAP 38, actually continues this series of experiments. However, by changing the firing mechanism, going back to a so-called simpler firing mechanism, the MAP 1830 used a hammer, returning to the way it's normally done in submachine guns, firing the bolt from an open position thanks to a dedicated trigger lever. Even so, the firing system remains relatively complicated. Because, for example, the MA-38 doesn't have a fixed firing pin, as many submachine guns will later have, but a moving firing pin that only moves forward when the weapon is closing. I'm explaining this now instead of during disassembly because the weapon, we'll see, has been converted to semi-automatic. Its firing mechanism now resembles the MAB 1830s, as both use a hammer, which we'll see more clearly during disassembly. The official name, MAP 38, comes from the March 22, 1938 patent. Even though now I'm going to tell you something very important, what everyone thinks of as the MAP 38 and what I keep calling the MAP 38 and will continue to call the MAP 38. It's not a MAP 38, it's a MAP 38A. In fact, there was an earlier version called the MAP 38, whose main feature was that the ejection port was perfectly vertical. However, during army tests, they didn't like this feature because it had the habit of spitting the shells at the shooter. The new version would slightly rotate the ejection port to allow it to eject to the side, away from the shooter. This version was the one that was adopted and was called the MAP 38. Other small changes would concern a second production line, a second version of the MAP 38A, which would change. For example, details like the compensator introduced a second version of the MAP 38A, the famous compensator that we will see and test. The MAP 38 would have a very long life, apart from being used extensively during World War II. Its production ended in the 1970s, and there were still several units that used the MAP 38 until the 1990s. In this sense, it was definitely one of the longest-lasting submachine guns in history. This was also thanks to its excellent ballistic characteristics and high-quality workmanship, even though the latter is a bit of a double-edged sword. To understand exactly what I'm talking about, we first need to take a close look at how it's made, and then of course take it to the shooting range and draw our own conclusions. And here we are taking a look at this amazing MAB 38. Specifically, we're dealing with the MAB 38A, because as we've seen, there have been various versions of this weapon. This is one of the very first and most refined versions, also because later on they would be simplified. This is, in a sense, still a first-generation submachine gun, so it's well-finished, well-made, and set in wood. It's not like a pistolet pulemio sudaiva, a pepesha, or a sten made cheaply purely for wartime. Let's start looking at its features. Let's start in particular with the markings. As you can see, here it tells us that it's a Beretta model 38A. We also have the serial numbers repeated here on the front. With the addition that this one was converted to 9x21, it was done at a time when the 9x19 was not yet widespread. And obviously, the biggest mechanical feature is that it was converted to semi-automatic, since the automatic trigger, the rear one, doesn't work. But it was also converted to a closed bolt because these weapons are normally open bolt. The sights of the weapon are, as you can see, very well made and adjustable. This kind of reveals the fact that, mentally speaking, this is a submachine gun from before the war. In fact, these are weapons that are used at very short range, especially the nice ones, which rarely have adjustable sights. Or if adjustable, they had just a few positions. See? I can adjust the aim up to a distance of 500 meters, which is very ambitious for a weapon of this kind, but ballistically, it's definitely possible. Up front, there's a tall, noticeable front sight mounted on a sleeve that also serves as a compensator. As you can see, there are these notches, the barrel ends here, and these notches help stabilize the weapon. In fact, they help quite a lot. We'll see that as well during our live fire test. Then we have a pretty obvious charging handle that allows us to operate the bolt. The charging handle would normally stay back and we would have to bring it forward, because in automatics the bolt stays back and fires from an open bolt. Then we quite obviously have the magazine, which we can release with this tab. The magazines came in various sizes, 20, 30 or 40 rounds. This is one of the shorter ones, a 20 round magazine, which to be fair is still a lot of rounds. As you can see, the wood on the weapon is truly beautiful. This is a single piece, and it's not at all easy to work wood into a single piece like this. Here too, it takes a lot of time and a lot of skill to be able to make things like this. The wood also has, as you can see, 2 grooves for placing your hand in 2 different positions during shooting operations. We'll discuss this a bit more in detail during the live fire test. Apart from this, we obviously have the ejection port on the left side of the weapon. It's a bit unusual to have the ejection port on this side. As for long guns though, it's perfectly fine. By the way, this ejection port, as we mentioned, the first ones had it perfectly centered, vertical, but too many shells would fly onto the shooter. So they decided to change the ejection angle, and the only place to change it was to the left. Since the charging handle is on the right, they couldn't rotate it to that side. This is the simple explanation for why the MAB 38 has the ejection port on the left side. There's a charging handle in the middle. We can take a look inside to see how the weapon is made, obviously by disassembling it as we usually do. We have this cap on the back of the weapon, and we can press this button inside. And rotate it. Be careful, there's a lot of tension on the spring. Here we have the cap, the spring guide rod. We need to rotate it because there are these 2 tabs that lock it in place, the weapon's own spring. Now we'll get to these details exactly. We can, using the loading method, push back the various mechanisms of the weapon. By removing the massive bolt, do you see this bolt? To laymen it might look normal, but actually this is a bolt that's been adapted to work with a different firing system. In fact, here we have a notch, and as you can see, there's a firing pin because inside this weapon there's a hammer. In fact, this one isn't made this way. It's a simple blowback weapon, it's a blowback weapon, but not with a fixed firing pin. It has an internal hammer. We could continue disassembling it by unscrewing the loading plug here, but there's no need. The massive bolt reveals to us also because this weapon has a really slow rate of fire. This is, without exaggeration, the heaviest submachine gun bolt I've ever handled, and I have some experience with them. It ensures both a proper closing and a slightly slower opening. Remember, these 9x19s were originally the powerful 9x19M38, so they still need a sturdier bolt, even though they're still blowback action. So with the inertia of the bolt itself, a heavy bolt also ensures better reliability if there's dirt in the weapon. Anyway, the moving mass, the inertia, the moving mass, the whole closing face, in fact, helps with feeding. As you can see, the shapes here are quite... On one hand, they're simple, if we think about other, more complicated weapons, but for a submachine gun, it's still relatively complicated. As you can see, there's not much else to show in terms of the mechanics. So let's do this. Let's put everything back inside properly. Here we go. Let's put our bolt back in. Here it is. Now we can put our cap with the recoil spring back in. Here we struggle a bit with the tension of the spring itself. And now we have to find, here it is, the right position. And here we are at the SIR shooting range in Spessa, where we're finally going to test this amazing MAB 3838. Of course, the critics among you will say that it's not automatic, but we have these absurd laws in Italy. Maybe someday, in a more civilized country, we'll try an automatic one, but for now, let's take our magazine. There are 20, 30 and 40 round magazines. The 20 round is standard and may be better for police use. Let's insert it. Unfortunately, the way to cock it is always on the wrong side. But let's move in front of the bolt and fire. Rightly so. Wait, here we go. And we're out of rounds. The bolt stays, as you can see, closed. Since this is a conversion anyway, very well. So first impressions. I must say that indeed it's difficult to evaluate this weapon also because of the lack. Given my experience with World War II submachine guns, especially in automatic mode, let's talk about automatic fire. Having had this opportunity, I'll tell you, that's the first thing. The first thing I thought when I picked it up was that it's heavy. This is a submachine gun from a previous generation, meaning the time when during World War II they started making submachine guns out of sheet metal. By saving as much as possible on parts for mass production, they often also become lighter. It's very heavy for a submachine gun. It reminds me of the Thompson in some ways, which is a chunk of very heavy steel, but this weight is very well balanced in that sense. I'll show it with the magazine inserted. The wooden parts show where to hold the weapon. You get good balance here in the front, but also in a more shooting-oriented position. For precision, we could say with the elbow more bent. And so the weight is distributed more centrally, making you very stable. As for the recoil, especially thanks to the weight, it's extremely manageable, meaning the weapon moves back and only slightly goes up. Obviously, the compensator on the weapon also helps a lot, but I can imagine, based on my experience with automatic fire on other weapons, that it's extremely controllable. Between the compensator, the weight, and also how this weight is distributed. With this shoulder and automatic, it probably stays on target the whole time. Let's reload. Let's try again. Let's try. So another magazine. As always, by the way, it goes in very smoothly. It's odd it's so far forward, but in a way, the MAB is still a first-generation submachine gun, maybe the last of the very first-generation submachine guns. In some ways, even in how it ended up, it resembles an Maschinenpistole, 18 more than a World War II submachine gun. Let's see. Yes, this is an automatic. It always stays in the same position. Even when firing faster, it's easy to handle. The sight, I'll tell you, the front sight is very tall and clearly visible. I get the impression that the rear sight notch is quite wide in a way. Maybe, one might think a long gun is for precision shooting, but you can't really do precision shooting with it. With a submachine gun with an open bolt, even in single shot mode, it gives you great visibility on the target, which really helps with the submachine gun, in my experience. Actually, I repeat, don't try to do anything with this Merino because it's so wide. Hole in the hole, you shouldn't expect to make hole in the hole with a weapon like this. Let's reload and try. Let's try again because I'm really having a blast. Cut, a hit. Very much with the hood. We're out of rounds. As always, we remove the magazine and do a quick chamber check. The Mark 38 is an extremely interesting weapon, more than one person. Expert influencer Gantaber has regularly called it the New York submachine gun of World War II. It definitely feels very pleasant to shoot. A solid submachine gun, a stable submachine gun, maybe a bit heavy for its role, but ironically, in certain situations that could help. In this way, it reminds me a bit. The Thompson isn't light. It's actually heavier, simply put, than a long Marchianò, ironically. However, it's worth considering whether, from a military and logistical point of view, it really was the best submachine gun of World War II. Let me explain. It's a well-made, well-finished weapon and, in a way, a first-generation submachine gun. It doesn't use those sheet metals, those cheap parts that later weapons would use. In fact, the number is relatively low, especially compared to the American grease guns, British Stens, Pistolet, Pulemyot, Sudeva, and Soviet Pistolet, Pulemyot, Sudeva H. The MAB 38 was produced in very few units. And one has to wonder if a simpler submachine gun wouldn't have been more successful and widespread among the troops, thus increasing the short-range firepower of the Italian infantry. However, this is perhaps a reflection more suited for historians and future generations than for us here at the shooting range. I want to thank everyone who watched this video, and first of all, I want to thank the owner of this wonderful MAB, thanks to whom we were able to make this video. Without people like you reaching out and offering weapons to test, I couldn't do this. These videos wouldn't be possible at all. If you want to contribute to the channel in this way, write to me. In the channel information, you'll find my email or my social media. If you want to contribute actively, not with weapons, but maybe financially, to pay for this wonderful field, you can subscribe or buy the channel's t-shirts. Saint Vlado, in fact, will solve 80% of your jams and add 5 holy damage to your weapons. If you have trouble with vampires, witches, or zombies, it really helps. If you don't want to or can't, at least consider leaving a like and a comment on the channel. It helps a lot. YouTube dislikes firearms. Social media lie. Just like lately good old Mark Zuckerberg, the famous reptilian founder of Meta and Facebook. He admitted it from the field, sir. That's all with this amazing Up 38, and we'll see you next time. Thank you all.